Larkspur, mid-autumn. The land was a sheet of faded parchment, cracked and smudged with old brushstrokes of sage and mesquite. Hills rolled low and tired, hunched under the brittle weight of an endless sky. No wind moved the grass. The sun hung like a forgotten coin, tarnished and distant, offering no warmth, only light, and too much of it. Along a dirt path barely clinging to memory, a lone rider came slow. His coat was oiled dark, sun-worn at the shoulders, and draped like molasses over his lean frame. His horse, a roan with a crooked gait, limped slightly, one front hoof wrapped in stained cloth. Neither spoke, not even to the windless air. It wasn't necessary. Men like Abel Cord did not arrive with flourish or fire. They simply emerged from the horizon, like old debts come due. Larkspur revealed itself without introduction. One main street with false fronts and empty stoops, a crooked chapel tower, and a feed store that had more boards than shingles. Dust settled heavy on every roof and rail, like the town had been held under too long and left to dry wrong. The townsfolk were already gathered by the time Abel dismounted. They stood in rows, quiet, upright, and still, not with curiosity, but with the slow fatigue of people who'd seen too much and felt too little. Children stood beside mothers, men with hats in their hands. No one spoke. Even the dogs watched. At the center of it all, tied to a leaning post outside the old jailhouse, was a woman. She was barefoot. Her hair, thick and dark with sweat and earth, hung in clumps around her face. Her blouse had been torn down the back, fabric hanging like wilted petals. Blood had begun its slow descent, some old, dark, and rusted, some fresh, following the grooves carved by leather and salt. Her arms trembled, but her back stayed straight. A man stood beside her, holding a long switch of dry willow, sheriff perhaps, or just a man who'd claimed the right to punish her. He didn't raise the branch again, not yet. Not with the crowd still half watching and half praying it would be done. Abel said nothing. He only tethered his horse to the rail beside the blacksmith's cold forge and watched. He did not ask what the woman had done. He did not need to. It was always food, or firewood, or some man's pride. His eyes traced the scene like he was reading a map. The line of boot prints leading from the boarding house, the scuffed dirt near her feet, the absence of rope burns on her wrists. She hadn't fought, or she'd known it wouldn't matter. He saw the preacher's widow standing at the edge of the crowd, holding a basin of water. Her face was hard, not cruel, just resigned. The switch came down once more, a soft whistle in the air, then a wet snap. The woman didn't scream. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes, downcast, seemed to search the dust for something, maybe a coin, maybe a place to disappear. Abel turned his face away, not in revulsion, but in refusal. He walked past the crowd, into the silence of the boarded-up saloon. The bat-wing doors were long gone. Inside, dust lay thick on the bar like a second floor. He found a bench and sat. From there, through the broken window, he could still see the post. He sat, hat in his lap, coat folded across one knee. By the time it ended, the sun had tilted west, and shadows were taller than the men who cast them. The woman was cut loose. She fell, but only to her knees. The preacher's widow moved forward, basin in hand. No one else followed. Abel remained where he was until the street emptied. The sound of boots faded. A door shut somewhere, then another. A chicken called from an unseen yard. Finally he stood and stepped back into the sun's tired glare. He walked to the jailhouse post where dried blood made ink-blot patterns in the dirt. There her blouse lay torn and folded like forgotten laundry. He did not touch it. Instead he walked past it all, past the preacher's widow, who had now helped the woman onto a cart, past the mule that chewed dry straw without appetite, past the town that did not look at him. He found the livery stable abandoned, but still holding the smell of horse sweat and kerosene. Upstairs, in a loft once used for hay, he set down his things, his coat, then the bedroll. He sat against the wall. One window, no glass, looked down toward the preacher's small house where the woman had been taken. From here, she was just a pale flicker, moving behind curtainless panes. Abel did not sleep. He listened to the board shift, to the mule call once, to her silence. He did not write anything in his ledger that night. The book remained closed beside him, leather creased and smoothed with age, no names added, none crossed out. Outside, the sky turned the color of wet ash, and the wind at last stirred just enough to move the dust. Morning came slow over Larkspur, the kind of morning that didn't rise so much as settle, a thin amber light laying itself over the rooftops and fences like breath over glass. There was no rooster, no bell, no clang of tools, just the soft creak of timber and the groan of old nails adjusting to another day. Abel Cord stood on the loft's edge, the barn below quiet, but for the occasional shuffle of his roan. The horse had lain down in the straw, side heaving gentle, the bandage on its hoof darkening with old blood. Abel poured water from a canteen into a wooden bowl and set it beside the animal without a word. He stroked its mane once, then stepped outside, coat already slung over his shoulder. Across the road, the preacher's house sat faded but kept. White paint clung to the boards in flakes, like snow refusing to melt. A vine of dead ivy traced one side of the porch, and the windows, open to the dry air, revealed little but dusk glitter and quiet. She was there. He saw her through the screen door, moving slow, one hand on the edge of a table, the other cradling a tin cup. Her back was bandaged now, thin linen strips curling slightly at the edges. Her hair had been washed, though still uncombed, and it fell in a long wet rope down her shoulder. Her feet were bare on the wood floor. She paused when she saw him watching. They did not nod, did not speak. Abel turned and walked down the narrow lane that led behind the livery toward the broken fence that circled what had once been a vegetable patch. There were dry stalks of corn, some stunted sunflowers, and a scatter of brittle gourds. He found a hammer and a rusted tin of nails in the ruins of a tool shed and began working. The preacher's widow came by later, quiet as smoke. She was tall and dry-eyed, with hands like old maps and a face carved into stern planes. She handed him a dented tin of boiled beans without ceremony and stood a while beside him, watching the fence take shape again. She didn't do what they said, the widow murmured, but that's not what they punished her for. Abel didn't look at her. He drove another nail, the sound sharp and final. They punished her because she don't belong, because she don't have a man's name, she said, and no man claimed her. Abel set the hammer down. He wiped his brow with the sleeve of his coat and stared out at the dry stalks. I won't stop feeding her, the widow added, almost to herself. Let the town whisper. She left the tin on a flat rock near the fence. Abel didn't thank her. She didn't expect it. He ate in silence. That night, as the last light bled out behind the hills, Abel sat on the loft floor, knife in hand, whittling a piece of dry mesquite. He wasn't shaping it into anything, just moving the blade to feel the wood yield. His hat sat beside him. His ledger remained closed. Down below, the roan stirred once in its sleep. From the window he could see the preacher's house lit by a single oil lamp. Her silhouette moved behind a linen curtain, bent, then upright, then still. 3 days passed like that. Abel repaired the fence. He fixed a broken shutter on the widow's porch. He fashioned a step for the back stoop where the wood had sunk and cracked. He said nothing through it all, not even when townsfolk passed and scowled. And each day she watched him from the porch, her hands tucked beneath a faded shawl. Sometimes she held the tin cup again, sometimes just sat with her back straight and eyes distant. It was late on the 4th evening when she finally crossed the street. Abel was on one knee, fitting a new hinge to the stable's side door. He heard her before he saw her, bare feet brushing loose gravel, the faint rustle of cotton. She stood a few paces behind him, wrapped in her shawl, face drawn but calm. The wind lifted her hair slightly, as if uncertain whether to move it. She knelt beside him without speaking. After a moment she pointed to the hinge in his hand, then to the door. Her fingers were small, knuckles scabbed. Abel passed her the hinge. She fitted it while he steadied the door. They worked in rhythm. The only sound was the creak of wood and the occasional tap of a nail. When the door held fast, she sat back on her heels. "My name's Junia," she said. Abel didn't answer, not because he hadn't heard, but because the name hung there like smoke, and some things needed time to settle before they could be touched. Junia didn't wait for a reply. She stood and crossed back toward the preacher's house, her shawl trailing behind her like dusk. Abel watched until the door closed behind her. He remained kneeling for a long time after, the hinge cool beneath his palm. That night, he opened the ledger, not to write, just to look at the names already there, names crossed out, names circled, names with no faces anymore. He ran his thumb down the last empty page and closed it again. The next morning, the mule arrived. It wandered into the garden behind the preacher's house just before sunrise, skinny, wild-eyed, and breathing hard, as if it had outrun something only it knew. Its coat was patchy, with old scars along its flank. It stomped at the dry ground and kicked over a bucket, but didn't bolt. Junia stood on the porch with a tin of oats in her hand, unmoving. The mule eyed her, snorted once, then stepped closer. Abel, watching from the fence line, said nothing. The sun rose behind them, slow and pale. Shadows stretched across the cracked ground, and the sound of the mule eating was the only thing alive in the air. Abel turned and walked back to the stable, the faintest trace of a frown settling in his eyes, not anger, not confusion, just the knowledge that something had changed, and the awareness that he could not stop it. 3 weeks into the silence, the days turned brittle. A high wind began to visit Larkspur now and then, not the kind that lifted hats or slammed shutters, but the kind that seemed to search the place, rustling through weeds, poking under floorboards, testing the town for signs of life it might have missed. Dust rose and settled again, never quite escaping. It clung to hair and skin and thought. The mule stayed. It never wandered beyond the preacher's fence. Junia tethered it lightly during the day, though it never tested the rope. Abel built a lean-to from old planks and set it behind the house without being asked. He found a rusted curry comb in the livery's corner and left it hanging from a nail in the beam. She began brushing the mule every evening. They did not speak again. The days carved themselves into routine. Abel fixed the church roof. Junia planted rows in the dry soil where the gourds had withered. The preacher's widow helped her mend a water barrel. When the mule kicked it apart the next day, Abel repaired it without comment. It was a kind of rhythm, a fragile, deliberate one, but it could not last. Late one morning, Abel stood at the edge of the corral, watching the mule nose through a heap of wind-fallen apples the widow had bought from a peddler. Junia crouched beside it, hand resting lightly on its shoulder. She moved easier now, still stiff, still healing, but the tremble in her hands was gone. Her hair had begun to lighten at the tips from the sun. Her dress had been mended and re-dyed with walnut husk, giving it the color of bark after rain. Abel looked away only when a rider crested the hill from the west. He was small from the distance, just a smear of black on yellow dust, but he came with certainty. A lone figure mounted straight, moving without haste or hurry. Abel turned toward the church and disappeared through the back door. By the time the rider reached town, Junia had already drawn the mule inside the shed and bolted the gate. She stood behind it, holding the latch with both hands, her back to the shadowed wall. She didn't look afraid, just waiting. The rider stopped outside the jailhouse. He didn't call out. He didn't ask questions. He dismounted, watered his horse, and sat on the porch, rifle across his knees. No badge, no insignia, but he didn't need them. He wore the stillness of a man who had once worn a star. Abel returned by sundown. He walked through the center of Larkspur like he always had, head down, steps measured, no rush in his blood. When he passed the rider on the jailhouse porch, they shared a glance, not recognition, not greeting, just a quiet knowing. Inside the preacher's house, Junia moved bowls from the table to a shelf, her face unreadable. The mule kicked once in its stall, and she muttered something under her breath. Not a curse, not a prayer, just sound to remind the air she was still there. That night lightning came. It lit the sky without sound, like a lantern flaring behind canvas. No rain, not yet. Just electricity crawling along the bones of the land. The mule grew restless. Junia sat beside it until its breathing slowed. Abel watched from the loft, knife idle in his lap. Before dawn, Junia knocked once at his door. She didn't speak when he opened it. She stepped inside, barefoot, wearing her old shawl. Her eyes met his in the dark. He stepped back. She sat on the floor beside his bedroll, her knees drawn up, head resting lightly against the wall. They didn't touch. He didn't ask why she had come. Her presence was a shape in the dark, and that was enough. By morning, she was gone. Abel found a wooden bowl on the loft's edge, warm cornbread wrapped in cloth. She'd left it without sound. He ate it slowly, watching the wind pull at the preacher's curtain. Later that day, the writer left. No words, no confrontation, just a look exchanged between him and Abel as the dust kicked up under hooves. It wasn't a warning, nor a farewell, just a way of saying, they know where you are. That night, Junia returned to the stable with the currycomb. She didn't see Abel, though he watched her from the shadows. Her hand moved in long, practiced strokes down the mule's flank. The animal pressed into the touch. She began to hum, low, tuneless, just a murmur from deep in her chest. It was the first time he'd heard her voice since she'd said her name. When she turned to leave, she saw him. For a moment, neither moved. Then, without a word, she walked toward him and stood close enough to touch. Abel looked down at her hand. In it she held a letter, folded, creased at the corners. She didn't offer it to him. She just looked at it, then looked at him. "It's not from anyone," she said. "It's to someone, but I never sent it." He nodded once. She placed the letter on a hay bale, turned, and left the stable. Abel did not read it, not yet. He watched the candle burn low. Then, with the sound of thunder rolling distant over the hills, he opened his ledger and scratched out the only name left uncrossed, his own. He tore the page from the book and stared at it for a long time. Outside, the mule brayed once into the wind, and far off, though neither of them could see it yet, the U.S. Marshals were riding east, trailing the long silver line of an unbroken riverbed. The Marshals arrived just before dawn, 3 of them. No insignias, no colors, just government dust on government boots. They came with long rifles and federal silence, their horses coated in sweat and red clay. They didn't ask directions. They didn't need to. They'd followed a trail of stillness through dead towns and empty ledgers straight into the heart of Larkspur, where nothing moved too fast, and every footstep was remembered by the dust. Junia watched them from behind the curtain. The preacher's house had no doors that locked, but it had the silence of prayer, and that had kept her safe so far. Beside her, the mule chewed a corner of canvas, oblivious. She put her hand on its withers, calm but firm. Her back still ached on cold mornings, and the scars were hardening now, raised chords of memory etched across the skin like a map of pain survived. She didn't flinch as the first marshal dismounted. Abel was already waiting at the edge of the canyon. He'd left before the sky changed color, coat buttoned, hat low, saddle left behind. Just a rifle and the worn leather ledger beneath his arm. He stood near a cluster of shale, wind tugging at the hem of his duster, watching the path coil up from the valley like a snake, too tired to strike. Junia had woken to find only a folded note and a name. No letter, no farewell. Just a single line written in the same hard, deliberate hand that had carved fence posts and mended doors. "Your name is Junia Cord." She read it once, then again. Then she burned it. The marshals found him standing like a cairn, motionless, half-shadowed, older than he was. He didn't move when they approached. He didn't raise his hands. He just looked at the man in the middle and said, low as dust sliding off rock, "You can take me in. I won't run." The marshal didn't reply. He didn't have to. His face was carved from law, cheekbones sharp, eyes like dry flint. He nodded once, and the men began to move. Abel placed the ledger on the flat stone beside him and stepped forward. One of them reached to shackle him, but the lead marshal raised a hand. No irons. Abel walked without resistance. They passed the edge of Larkspur in silence. No crowd gathered, no doors opened, only the preacher's widow stood on her porch, arms folded. She did not wave, she did not weep. In the garden, Junia stood with one hand on the mule's halter. Her face was unreadable. Abel didn't look back, but as the marshals led him past the outskirts, past the graves and the wind-bent crosses and the field where fence posts still leaned like tired sentries, he paused. The marshal turned, but Abel only lifted his hand once, fingers curling slightly. Not a wave. Something older than goodbye. Then he walked. Junia remained at the preacher's house. She cleaned the rooms. She tended the garden. She fed the mule, whose ribs had begun to round out, whose ears flicked at every sound like it expected him to return. The name Cord came slowly to her lips, first when she introduced herself to a traveler in need of water. Then when she signed for flour at the feed store. No one corrected her. The townspeople avoided asking. She wore the name like a coat passed down, too large at first, unfamiliar at the shoulders, but she grew into it day by quiet day. She carved spoons from driftwood and left one at the chapel door, repaired the schoolhouse steps, painted the widow's shutters. She never said his name aloud, but when she knelt at the stream and washed her hands, she sometimes touched her reflection, as if to remind herself she belonged. The marshals took Abel Cord to Ellsworth Depot, where the courthouse stood like a coffin turned upright. No trial was held. His crimes were listed in brief, read in low tones by a tired clerk. Desertion, harboring, alteration of bounty records. The judge was a man with a gold ring and a greased beard who did not look at Abel once. The sentence was 10 years of hard confinement. He nodded once as if to say, "Fair enough." In his cell he watched the sun crawl across the wall in slats of yellow and rust. He never spoke unless spoken to. He never touched the bread unless it was fresh. And he never opened his mouth to say her name. She was free. That was enough. Months passed, then seasons. A rain finally came to Larkspur. It began as a mist, then a hush, then a full curtain, soft and steady, like someone crying for the first time in years. The land drank greedily. Dry roots split and bloomed. The air changed. The wind turned kind. Junia stood barefoot in the garden, the hem of her dress-soaked hair sticking to her temples. She raised her palms to the sky. The mule stood beside her, unmoved, as if it had expected this all along. Inside the house the window pane dripped. On the table lay a small flat stone. She had carved his name on it once, then sanded it smooth again. Now it sat blank, still, waiting. Later that evening she carried it to the tree by the fence and placed it in the earth. No cross, no flowers, just a stone in the dirt, nestled beneath the branches where the first drops had fallen. She didn't say a word. But as she stood there, shoulders straight, hands at her sides, the last rays of sunlight broke through the clouds and lit her face in gold. Not a smile, not a tear, just peace. The wind moved gently through the leaves, and behind her the mule turned toward the horizon, ears forward, as if it too was waiting. It was the kind of rain that didn't stop, not in sheets or storms, not in thunder or flash. It came soft, steady, as though the sky had decided at last to remember the land. It soaked the roofs of Larkspur, crept between floorboards, swelled seeds long buried and long forgotten. It filled the dry creek with a slow, glassy current and left a green haze rising from the hills like smoke. The town changed. Paint flaked off and washed clean. The dirt streets turned to mud, but the air smelled sweet with it, like earth unspooling. Chickens scratched and clucked in places where silence had once ruled. A boy was born in a sod house east of the chapel. A traveling tinker stopped and stayed, hammering tinware from inside the old saloon. The widow reopened her parlor for sewing. The name Cord was spoken now, not often, not loudly, but it passed from hand to hand, whispered over fences, mentioned when folks asked who fixed the chapel bell or mended the back gate. Sometimes it came with a pause, sometimes a nod. Junia Cord lived in the preacher's house. She never moved out. She kept to her routines, watering the garden, brushing the mule, boiling herbs in silence. Her back healed into something stronger than scar. She wore dresses dyed in the color of river stones, hair always braided, face unreadable, but never cold. She walked with a limp that came when the mornings were damp, but she never slowed. Children came by to watch her feed the mule. She let them. She built a small bench beside the old tree, the one near the flat stone she never spoke of. People sat there now and then, said nothing, left small things on the stone, a feather, a coin, a broken tooth carved from walnut. No one asked who the stone was for. They already knew. In his cell, Abel Cord counted shadows. There were 67 steps between the bars and the window. He paced them sometimes, not to escape, but to remember what it felt like to move. The guards knew him by name, called him preacher, though he never said a sermon. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His hands had begun to stiffen. But he kept the same rhythm, quiet, patient, never begging, never bitter. The warden once asked if he wanted to file an appeal. Abel shook his head once. "I've already given my name," he said. And that was that. Back in Larkspur, the mule grew fat and content, its coat darkened with rain and good grain. It wandered the garden freely now, nosing into seed beds, kicking at fence rails that Abel had once nailed straight. Junia didn't stop it. She replanted what was crushed. She replaced the boards without complaint. She wrote no letters, not because she didn't want to, because she didn't need to. Every word between them had already been said, in silence, in glances, in the careful passing of a tin cup or a hammer. The rest was just memory being rinsed by rain. One morning, the mail stage stopped at Larkspur. A girl stepped off, a teacher, young and unsure. She asked for Miss Cord. Junia met her on the porch with tea. They sat side by side, the mule resting nearby. "I'll be staying through harvest," the girl said, brushing raindrops from her spectacles. "If the schoolhouse holds." "It will," Junia replied, voice low and even. That was all. The girl didn't press. Later, Junia walked her to the school and left her with the key. "People listen better in silence," Junia said. "Let the room do the work." And she walked away. Rain fell harder that night, not with fury, just with insistence. Junia sat at the table, trimming lamp wicks. She lit one, then another. She read a book with no cover and no author. It was one Abel had left behind, its pages bent at the corners, certain lines underlined with a firm hand. She traced one with her thumb. There are names not written on stone, but carried in the shape of how we live. She closed the book. Outside, the mule neighed once, restless in the wind. Junia rose, took her shawl, and stepped into the rain. At the edge of the garden stood the tree. The stone beneath it was slick with moss now. The carving was long gone, sanded and washed by time. But the shape of it, flat, smooth, placed with purpose, remained. It had not been moved. Junia knelt before it. The mud clung to her skirt. The air was thick and rich. She placed a small object on the stone, the old currycomb, its bristles worn to the bone. Then she stood, one hand on the tree trunk for balance, and looked east. Where the hills bent low and the land forgot itself in shadow, a faint glow pulsed. Distant lightning maybe, or maybe something else. The world perhaps stirring again. She stood like that for a long time, face turned to the wind, eyes open, body still. Behind her the mule stepped closer, water dripping from its mane. They stood side by side, and the rain kept falling, soft, patient, forever.